All right, everybody, good evening, and thank you very much for joining me. My name is Caleb Rothy. I'm the Percussion Education Coordinator for WGI. Really excited. This is going to be the very first of our ongoing percussion community webinar series that we're going to do this year. Really informal, very laid back. The plan is to have a special guest with me each time that I do this and to kind of talk about maybe a couple of key topics or ideas for that evening, and then open up the floor, open up questions to anybody that's here and get some feedback and some ideas from everybody. Our guest this evening is Kevin Shah. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Caleb. Thank you for having me.
For those that don't know Kevin, I just want to introduce him quickly. Kevin is one of the designers and arrangers behind Broken City and also Arcadia High School. He works as a front ensemble arranger and music coordinator for both of those groups and also works from an instructional standpoint, but is a huge creative force behind those two ensembles. In addition to that, also does some work with the Blue Knights Drum and Bugle Corps in the summer, serves as the music coordinator and the front ensemble arranger for that group. So one of the things exciting about Kevin is master educator, master designer, but works throughout the marching arts in a number of different ways. I know he's a prolific composer and arranger for marching bands as well. So really excited to be able to share some of his perspectives and insight with everybody tonight. And I, of course, want to thank all of you guys for joining us this evening, whether you're tuning in live or you're watching this as a recorded copy later. I'm really thankful that you're taking the leap of faith with us and trying this out this evening as we try something new here for the percussion division. So what I want to do tonight is I want to break this up into kind of two halves. The first half of this are a couple of things that Kevin and I have prepared for everybody. We wanted to talk a little bit about the beginning of the season, how to kick things off, maybe some suggestions for your groups to help prepare them for their first performance if you haven't had it yet, or maybe the first couple of performances here over the next couple of weeks. I also have just a couple of quick reminders from the bigger WGI perspective that I want to share with you. And then in the second half, what we'll do is we'll kind of open this up. I know a couple of people have sent in some questions to me of things that they want to ask Kevin about and things that are on their minds. All of you that are attending live this evening, we certainly want you to participate as well, and there's a couple of different ways for you to do that. One way is if you want to type out a question, there's a little method and little chat box over on the side where you can type out a question, and then I'll go through and read those to Kevin. We also have the ability, if you're plugged into a microphone this evening, if you want to raise your hand, there's a little raise hand button, and I'll pop on over to you and unmute your line, and then you can ask your question live or maybe get involved in the conversation. We want to keep this really casual, we want to keep this fun, and definitely make sure that we have a chance to kind of interface and interact as much as possible. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to mention very briefly a little point of clarification that came out this week regarding one of our new rules, or one of the stipulations with regards to props. Let me pull up the text of this really quickly so that we can get to the actual thing here. Everybody's familiar, a couple of years ago we implemented in the activity rule that any performer that was on a prop that was 6 feet in height or higher needed to be protected basically from injury. And the two ways to do that were with a harness or with some safety railing. It's an OSHA stipulation, something that we probably should have had in the rule book long ago, but really happy that it's there now to keep performer safety at the forefront. One of the things that was added to the rule book this year was a stipulation specifically about props or platforms being moved with a performer on top of that prop. And so we just wanted to hit a couple of bullet points for those that maybe haven't heard yet. If a performer's feet are more than 6 feet above the competition area and the prop is in motion, the performer must actively use the appropriate safety railing or harness for the entire time the prop is in motion. If the same prop is not in motion, the safety railing or harness must be in place, but the performer has the option on whether to use those items while in a stationary position. If the performer's feet are less than 6 feet above the competition area, then no safety railing or harness is needed for the prop, whether stationary or in motion. So that was the question that we had gotten from a couple of people of, if I've got a 4-foot prop in motion, does that have to have the safety railing or the safety harness? No, it doesn't. It's anything 6 feet or higher, whether it's stationary or in motion. We want to make sure that any prop that is in motion has the necessary things to make sure that the performer is going to be safe. So if you're doing anything like that, just think about performer safety first and foremost. That's certainly a good best practice to have in mind for everybody. I also wanted to mention to everybody that's in attendance tonight the message that you got from the office a little bit ago about performance repertoire and the change that we had this season about filling that out. Just wanted to mention to everybody that if you hadn't done so already, make sure that you hop onto the directors only area of the WGI website and enter in all of your repertoire information this season into the little link that redirects you to the Tresona page. It's really important that you get that done now, as you won't be able to perform at a WGI event without all of that stuff on record. United States copyright law requires that any of the works that are performed at one of these events have to have the appropriate permission to arrange in place and things of that nature. So you just want to make sure that you're good to go and everything's above board before you get to the competition, so that you're not setting yourself up for some frustration on the day of the event, as you wouldn't be able to participate if you don't have that stuff in line. So a couple little housekeeping things tonight. Thank you guys so much for taking care of both of those things and getting on top of those. All right, so what we wanted to talk about tonight is kind of some early season stuff, things that we can do to prepare and to get our ensembles and specifically our students ready for this part of the season, the part that we're initiating. I know a couple of circuits had their first competition last weekend and have already kicked things off. I know a huge portion of the country is beginning this weekend, and if not this weekend, then within the next week or two, I imagine most groups will have their first performance of the season. So I wanted to get Kevin on here tonight and kind of pick his brain a little bit, share some of my ideas and some of my perspectives about gearing up for the first show of the season. So Kevin, if you would, could you please talk to us about some of the things that you do to help your ensemble gear up for their first show of the season?
Sure. I wrote down a couple little items on a list here. I think the biggest thing as I was typing this stuff out, everything kept coming back to making sure that you do a viable dress rehearsal before the competition, whether it's the day of or the week of, but at least you need to have at least one rehearsal where the focus of that rehearsal is not necessarily like working on the music or making the program better, but the focus needs to entirely be the process that your students and your staff and your parents are going to go through in terms of the logistics of getting on and off the floor. And I know for a lot of more experienced groups that this is something that's just kind of part of our repertoire. Like it's always planned that there's that last rehearsal before the first show is no more music, no more learning, no more cleaning. It's just dress rehearsal time. So and we'll get everybody out in uniform in the with all the equipment, and the best case scenario is to have all the parents there. I know it's not possible sometimes, so a lot of times when there's not parents there, for smaller programs that I've had in the past, I'll really try my hardest to do all of my logistical assignments within the membership only. And so some of that kind of goes into your planning phase. Like if you have an amazing booster organization with a lot of parental support, then go ahead and have the 20 props that need to be assembled. But over the years, I've found that at some of the programs where you don't necessarily have involvement, you have to be really frugal with it's not even a money thing. It's who's going to move those props in and out, who's going to help with the floor. Like if you have a battery of 8 people, can you get the heaviest, largest floor? So some of those things happen early season, like before you even start. So I would really take into account what is the capability of your ensemble and your students be able to do everything on their own as much as possible, and then sprinkle in parents after that. I've also found that the students will develop a greater sense of ownership with their equipment if they're the ones that are always in charge of pushing it on and off and dealing with the props. I know sometimes it's not optimal, but that's just a little mini planning thing that maybe some of you can't necessarily address now, but I think it's a good thing to think about for in the future. So the dress rehearsal before the first show is hugely important, and at that rehearsal, I'll make sure that I talk to the students about the fact that that's the point of that rehearsal, and I'll actually have the manual with me, whether it's my circuit manual or the WGI manual, and I'll kind of have the pertinent, things that they need to be aware of, like highlighted, so I can go through it with them. So that it's not just me screaming and yelling at the show on the floor. It's everybody has an understanding of what's going to happen. especially for those brand new, hard to keep their attention kids. Those are the ones that you have to really kind of make sure that, like, make it. I don't want to say a game, but like make them feel like that's a part of what it is that performance looks like, so that I guarantee you're going to have a couple of your students that are brand new to this thing that are going to come out on that floor for the first time. And if you didn't prep them for this, like the non-playing part of the activity, you're going to have a hard time kind of reining them in. And we've all seen the amazing times where you've been in the stands and trying to get, watching another instructor kind of rein in their students. That's something that we really want to avoid. So that's just preparation in advance. So that was the first one.
I think we've all been there before. I know at least I've had this experience as a teacher where you bring the kids out and you spend so much of the time working on, the 4 minutes that we're going to play today or the 5 minutes or whatever the case may be. Like we spent hours and hours and hours of man hours working on this. And then you get out there and you realize, oh my gosh, I haven't spent any time preparing them for that first minute when they're about ready to begin. And so all this chaos takes place. And, all of the effort that we've put on those 4 minutes are out the window because everybody's exhausted and frazzled just trying to get onto the floor. So I think that's such sage advice. Kevin, when you do this dress rehearsal, is this an extra rehearsal that you schedule, or do you take part of one of your regular rehearsals? How does that usually work out for your groups?
Usually it'll just be a part of one of our rehearsals. If you have the luxury of having attendance and doing it outside of the scope of your playing rehearsal, you could do that. And some of you, maybe you only rehearse in class periods, and if you want the parents there, maybe you need to do like a night rehearsal, or maybe you can only get the gym, maybe on a Sunday. Like maybe that's the only time you can get into the gym. But it might be worth experimenting with your school and your parents and seeing, when you guys do your early season meeting, kind of find out what's good for your community. And if that means that, hey, if your parents are super busy but they can be there on a Sunday night and the gym is free, maybe you got to do the Sunday night before your first weekend as your, especially if you have a ton of props. If there's ever a show where I have a lot of props or a lot of setup, a lot of logistics, then we'll really try hard to get into a gym with parents there. If you don't have a ton of that stuff and you can manage most of it with your high school, then that's fine too. I work at Canyon High School, and over the years currently we're mostly concert group, but in the past we've had a really, little A-class group with a very small battery, very small pit, and I really tried hard to make it such that we only needed 3 parents, 2 for the speakers, 2 for the main speakers and 1 for the sub. And so I try my best with my really tiny groups to make everything just self-running and not have to rely on parents so much.
When you do some of those dress rehearsals, is it kind of a walkthrough where you just tell everybody, hey, when you get to a show, this is what you're going to be doing? Or do you have them literally take their gear out of the competition area, simulate bringing it in, simulate doing the floor, and simulate exiting? Like, how extreme do you go in that preparation?
Both. I literally go all the way to the extreme at what you just described. So we'll start the first part of the rehearsal walking through everyone will set up. We'll have the full thing set up on the floor, and I'll make sure. So for the front ensemble, we'll go through and every single student, I will say, okay, what's your responsibility? If they don't have a responsibility, I'll make sure that they have someone that could be helping, or hey, Jimmy's doing the power, but I want you to be number 2. So if you're looking over and the power's not plugged in, it's your job to reinforce that, etc. So I'll make sure that every single chain of the setup is accounted for with every single member of the front ensemble, and then same thing with the floor folding. One of the things that I am a huge believer in with the floor fold is that when you have the floor, like when you initially fold the floor in and out during your rehearsals, I'm a pretty particular on being the same students in the same spots at every single time. So like when we set the floor up, everyone has assigned spots. So for example, when you first pull out your floor, I think some of us has probably experienced that you've got 30 students on one corner and then one student on the other, and then like, it's just like completely out of balance because everyone just scatters to wherever they want to go, especially when you're going to go pull the floor tight. You've got, it's really chaotic. So I actually go the extra mile and make sure that it's assigned. Every student knows exactly which spot they're pulling from, especially when you have a small battery. Like we were pulling floors in and out with an 8-person battery, like everything, like pulling it out, carrying it out the door, no help. So it took a lot of really like very precise planning with who's standing where. Like even when they're lifting the floor, like I gave them a specific order because I had like 3 really tall, strong kids all together, and then 2 really weak kids separated. So we actually made the order so that when they lifted the floor, 8 of them could do it by themselves in a very strategic and specific spot. So that's also something that we would spend probably in a 2-hour rehearsal, 2.5-hour rehearsal, about an hour on setup and about an hour on teardown. And by the end of that rehearsal, the goal is to do 1 full in, play the show, out, maybe 2 if it was bad. So that's the goal of that rehearsal, is to finish the rehearsal with a full on and off timed, feeling good.
I think that's so valuable, that advice, because really if you invest that, you're talking about 2 hours, an hour to getting in dialed in, an hour to getting out dialed in. If you invest those 2 hours early season, that's so worth it over the course of the season to know that entry and exit is always going to be as smooth as possible. Just in terms of like member sanity and them controlling their emotions and making sure they're prepared to be at their best, but also in terms of making sure that you don't have damage to your equipment and potential things like that that could be very disruptive for the ensemble. So I think that's great advice. One of the things I always did with my groups was very similar process. Like we did the full-on practice getting in, practice getting out, time it with a stopwatch. Okay, that wasn't fast enough. Everybody do it again. And what I found so valuable about that is if you simulate it thoroughly like that, you can find all the choke points before you get to the show. You can realize that your distribution of labor was really good except for plugging everything into the snake. Like there was a choke point there, and that's what's slowing down the whole setup process. We need to distribute this a little bit better. Or the snares were handling pulling out the floor, and the bass drums and the tenors got these props, but it was this one other thing. It was this one component that seemed to be the inefficiency, and we just have to redistribute some of the members. Like, hey, tenors and bass drums aren't both doing this anymore. We're going to send one portion over here to this to distribute the the person power more evenly around the ensemble, or where it needs to be. So I think that's such great advice, Kevin. Thank you very much for sharing that.
And just wanted to quickly add to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, finding the choke points. A lot of times it's also finding the students that need a little bit more guidance in terms of how they're doing their jobs. It's one thing to just give assignments and say, ready, go, and expect everyone to do it. But just like when you find with the playing, some students are going to need a little bit more discussion in terms of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and also really training them to take it seriously, and that it's a performance and not just a game. So I've also found that having those conversations, I know it's kind of awkward because we're all pros here and we're all really intent on doing our business, but a lot of times I would say there's a small percentage of what we do is babysitting. So some of that percentage of time of like really relaying to some of those students that you have that are prone to hijinks, and them toned down now is going to save you major headaches later.
And I think most of us are in the habit of talking to our students about professionalism, talking to them about decorum and stage presence and things like that. This is the perfect opportunity to start that early season and say, look, the moment the gym doors open, you're on stage, everybody's watching you. So they watch you set up, and the quality of your setup, the way that the floor gets pulled out, definitely has an impression on the audience. Forget the judges and all that stuff, just the audience that's watching you. You want to make sure that everything you do is at the highest caliber possible. And Kevin, I would assume that this is true obviously for your world-class groups, but you probably use the same methodology down to your open and your A-class groups as well, in terms of thoroughness. Absolutely. And in terms of decorum and coaching up the students that need a little bit more information, all that good stuff. Yeah.
And even in the world class land, like it's easy to assume that they're all super pros. They're all 22 years old. They got this. Some of them, maybe didn't come from a program that had it all dialed in. So it's really important that regardless of what group you're in, to make sure that you have your set system that it is ingrained in you because you're going to be there at the show. So make sure that everyone there is following your personal system and not some
And
assumed system.
really you want it to become the culture of your ensemble. That's what you're trying to establish. So this goes with that, the temperament and the culture that you're trying to establish. Preparation to get on and off is such a huge key component of it.
Right.
So well stated. Hey, I was wondering if you might talk to us a little bit about what you talk to your students about as well for these early season performances. So beyond the like getting in and getting out, beyond all of those logistics and the machinations of being able to do that. What do you talk to them about psychologically to get ready for the first couple of performances?
So I think the biggest thing is to really start to find your students that generally to their instruments. So a lot of times you'll have students that are head buried into their instrument at all times. And really the reason for that is it's not just a performance thing, but it's as soon as they get in front of an audience and they peak up, they're going to have that moment of terror, and you have to get them used to having that terror. So we will actually practice things that make us nervous or like kind of create that nervous energy and then incorporate that into our playing. And some of that comes from your teaching style as well. It's a fine line of not necessarily, you're not being mean per se, but you are assuming the role of like an athletic coach at times. You do want to push them past their comfort zone psychologically so that they're a little bit tougher when it comes to being scared. When the adrenaline is going, when you're calling them out a little bit, and they're feeling a little nervous in rehearsal, that's just them getting stronger at reacting to those nerves. So I think that's a major part of the way that we rehearse our groups. It's if you're just looking at it from the outside, it might look like, oh man, those people are mean. It's just not. It's always information, but it's with a sense of urgency and to create a little bit of that nervous feeling in the students. And I always talk to the students about that. So I let them know that when they're in rehearsal, and it's not because I don't like them and because I think they're lazy and I think they're stupid. It has everything to do with building that sense of confidence and being able to shine in tough circumstance where they're nervous. So that would say that as we're getting closer to the first show, more of my commentary is based on that as opposed to the actual thing that they're performing.
Yeah, so well stated. I've always kind of done that same transition as well, where you spend so much of the preseason talking about information of like getting the show out and here's how you're going to play it and here's what you need to do here and all the mechanics of trying to play well. And the week or two leading up to the first show, that's when my commentary changed and I started to talk about putting yourself in that performance situation. Think of this run right now as your first performance of the season. What do you want it to sound like? What do you want it to look like? What do you want it to feel like? Put yourself in that place right now. So I think those kinds of visualization activities with your students where you ask them to put themselves in that seat are really powerful. It at least empowers them to think about it as not just another rep and rehearsal, but beginning with the end in mind, thinking about where we're headed and why we're doing each one of these things. I think another really tricky thing, and you kind of touched on this, is that sense of adrenaline that you get when you're in the show. That's a hard thing to manufacture in rehearsal. Like your body just doesn't respond the same way. So it's a hard thing to teach a student what to do with that or how to overcome that. You got to get reps under your belt live in front of people to get good at that. But I think talking to if you talk to your students about that and you say, here's what you're going to be feeling, here's everything that you're going to have to kind of compete with, that awareness, if you can give them that sense of awareness ahead of time and allow them to process that, that's going to ultimately allow them to be more successful at meeting those challenges head on once they get to their first performance and the adrenaline's going and the nerves are high. They'll be able to manage that a little bit more successfully.
Absolutely. And then one small minor point that's kind of related to that is memorization. I think most of your Mallet players and probably all of your battery players are not reading music anymore at this point in the season, but you might have a few students in your auxiliary section or timpani or synth that are still reading music. And I think it's important to address that. So I think for our activity, the norm is that everybody has the music memorized and they're playing it memorized. So it's really important that we start preparing for that now. But that's also going to affect your students' ability to not freak out in the performance, right? So the more that you can get them onto the memorization train now, that's going to help them. But also in regards to your synth players, I pretty aggressively make them make cheat sheets for the show, because if a synth player is out, then the whole thing is gone, right? So they make index cards with where their patch changes are and like letters and what to listen for, all that, just sitting on top of the synth. Just that's a small point. Just that goes to finding ways to train the students that are ways that even if they get freaked out, they have something to fall back on.
Yeah, and that kind of dovetails into one other thing that I wanted to share, which is while you're, during this time of the season, this is the ideal time to talk about all those what if scenarios with your students, and to walk them through like, hey, this instrument starts this piece, but if disaster strikes, here's the backup plan, here's plan B, here's how we're going to roll with those changes. If you can give that to them when you're practicing, when you're doing some of these dress rehearsals to get on and off, if you can throw at them hey, we don't have any power, what are we going to do? And start to come up with all those redundancy systems now, I think you're going to be thankful, because we know once we get into the middle of the season, we get so hyper-focused on trying to dial in all the errors and try to perfect the program and try to make sure that we're maximizing all the different things that we're trying to bring to life this year. It's easy to lose sight of, oh yeah, we need a backup plan in case something doesn't work, until it doesn't, until it's happening in real time, and then you regret not having done it. So just while you're doing all of the other inventory of, we got to talk to them about this and this and this and this, now's a good time for your backup plans too.
And a funny thing that we do, one of my groups has an analog mixer, so we don't have recall. So it's very possible that you go from the parking lot, put the cover onto the mixer, and then you get into the stadium or the gym, and all of the buttons and faders and everything is all messed up, right? So I actually play a game with my students, and where I'll set the mixer perfectly, like with everything correct, and I'll ask them to memorize, and then I'll tell them to turn around, and I'll just go through and be a phantom and change one or two things here and there. And that'll, it'll take 20, 30 minutes, but by the end of that little game, my synth player girl that's on my analog muted, soloed channel, if one of the gains is all the way up, a microphone, or all that stuff. So if you're still rocking analog mixer like I am, that's something that's been huge, because every once in a while you get to a show and you don't know what's going on. Why is that? Why are we feeding back? All that little and all the way, So that's a little game that you might want to try with your students if you have an analog mixer.
Heck, even if you're rocking a digital mixer, that would be worth doing, because we know sometimes, even if you're trying to control it wirelessly, you got to have that backup plan in case something's going wrong. So your students there on the floor physically are always the best backup plan, and if you can empower them with the knowledge of what to do if things go haywire, you'll be thankful that you did that, obviously. Kevin, so now beyond just getting ready for the first performance of the season, what kind of things do you emphasize in these early weeks with your students? What kind of things do you purposely try to de-emphasize? Like, where do you put the focus in these first couple of weeks for your groups?
At some point, we're going through this right now, currently with all of the groups, is we have to get the med out, and that's something that I think some people forget to plan into their weeks leading up. Like, you'll just take it out, and then all of a sudden everything will fall apart. Or maybe you didn't rehearse with it enough initially that there's not stability built into their muscle memory. So that's one big thing. And a lot of the things that we do now, we technologically we have the ability to make some pretty good MP3s in order for the students to listen at home and be familiar with the music. So that's a huge component, making sure that you're reinforcing them to use those resources when they can. And then we spend a lot of time singing our parts in rehearsal. just kind of singing through longer chunks of music, so that it's really embarrassing and funny at first for the students. Like they probably can't even get through a passage without breaking out into laughter. So you have to do that early in the season. If you try to do it on the day of the show, it's going to be futile. So we really start emphasizing singing early in the season. So by the time they're here in this part of the season, they're comfortable, and I could say, okay, letter F to H, let's sing through that real quick, and that's something that we do in the parking lot a lot. That's something that we'll do in the tunnel before we come out, just so that it's kind of part of their being. And so when they're performing, they're not thinking about 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I play a G sharp, and then they're not thinking about that. They're just thinking about the musical energy, the phrase that they're trying to convey, and they're also thinking about each other. They're thinking about how they relate to one another. And singing is also another good way to talk about balance from player to player. A lot of times you'll have some students that can really bellow it out, and there's some students that are super shy and talk real quiet. And you can really try to get them to hear not only their own voice, but how their voice blends with others. And it gets them to realize their contribution percussively when they're able to hear their individual voice as well as the people around them. So I think singing, honestly, is probably the biggest thing that we emphasize.
One of the things I always try to talk to my students about in this early part is that we're on a journey, and that these first couple of shows are not the most significant part of the season. That the results,
Right.
and I mean the competitive results, of course, but also just the performance, like, hey, everybody, come off the floor. How'd you guys feel about that? Those things are not as important as just working through this process, and that there are going to be good shows, there are going to be bad shows, there's going to be stuff that they play really well, there's going to be other moments that don't work, there's going to be stuff that they've been nailing in rehearsal that doesn't make it to the floor very well at this point of the season. So I just try to re-emphasize with them a lot that this is the first step, or maybe it's the middle step in a much longer process and a journey that we're on for the whole course of the season, and just try to keep that in perspective. I think in addition to that comes some of those competitive results. I always try to de-emphasize that stuff at the beginning of the season as much as possible and say, look, the numbers, the rankings, how all this stuff comes out is immaterial right now. It's not of that much value to me. What I want is a good, solid performance. I want you guys to take a step forward every single week. I want to make sure that we're performing to the best of our ability right now, because I want genuine audience reactions. I want to know when the audience is eating something up, and I want to know when the audience is flat. That gives me a lot of information about how I can tweak and modify the show. And I also want the best feedback from our evaluators that we can possibly get. So the more you put into trying to make this as real and as authentic as possible, the more valuable information we can get back. And all that other stuff, I mean, it'll work itself out over the course of the season. Just try to be the best you can right now, and try to be as real and as authentic as possible, warts and all, because we all have them at this point in the season.
Yeah, I definitely, I think that was a great point. I think philosophically, one of my biggest tenets is that I want every single student, every member, to feel like they're 100% successful with everything that they were asked to do. And that's not just philosophically for this show, but every show and the whole season. And that goes from preparing, but it also goes to designing, right? So making sure that you're giving your students an opportunity to be 100% successful. And I've seen a lot of times where what is being asked of the performer is possibly beyond their ability to be 100% successful. And I think that in my career has gone a long way, especially in the A and open class land, where I will, it's different if you're not the designer and you're working with the group, right? If you're the designer and you're working for your group, it's really easy to custom tailor every single stave to every single student. But if you've bought a pre-written show, I think it's really important for you to make the edits that are needed to make sure that every student can be 100% successful. And I really, really am aggressive with my students in terms of pushing that philosophy, and that's the goal for every single performance is, and that I think also determines how much we perform at the first show. We might have 4 or 5 minutes learned, but that doesn't mean that we can perform for 5 minutes to the best of our ability. And you know, a lot of my groups have famously taken a massive penalty at the first show because we'll only come out with 2 minutes, 3 minutes, because that's what we're ready to perform and show the world. And make it very clear to the students that yes, this is not necessarily the optimal scenario, and we're going to try to do better next time, but this is where we're at right now, and it's more important to me that you go and play amazingly to the best of your ability rather than just get it out there, because the feedback you're going to get is not going to be true feedback if you're falling over yourself in that last 30 seconds. So that's a personal choice. You know, people might try to do it a different way, but that's just something that we've decided to do.
So would it be fair to say that you prioritize quality over quantity in terms of deciding how much to put out at the first show?
Every single year. And so we try to build, you know, one of the goals for every first show is to try to make sure that we're within the penalty time, which is 4 minutes for WGI. However, that doesn't really work out for A class, because a lot of times your A class show is about 4 and change. So, you know, for most A class groups to not be in penalty, you're going to have to perform the whole show. And if you're prepared to do so at that first show, man, you're amazing. If you're not prepared to do that at the first show, but you have all the material, I would choose your battles. You know, maybe you're going to come out with more show and get some sort of perceived better score, but if your students aren't feeling successful, then to me, it's not worth it.
And I would imagine that it's probably a balancing act that is different for every ensemble, different for every season. I know I certainly have had years where, you know, you get through that first 2.5 minutes of show, and maybe that chunk went really quickly one year, and then we kind of get bogged down at just getting the production out for the rest. And so we don't have as much coming out as we want. Or, you know, we got through the first 4 minutes pretty quickly, and so it's all ready to go out there. Like, it just varies from year to year and group to group and show to show. Would you agree with that statement, Kevin?
I totally agree. I have a hard time because this is something that you have to balance. Like, a lot of times, the show is not completely finished being written before the first show, right? So you're still creating and pacing your show out, and I have a hard time stopping a show in the middle is performable because, oh, it doesn't feel like a finished ending or whatever. So instead of adding more material to make it feel finished, we probably err on the side of removing material. Like, you know, maybe we have 4 minutes on the floor, but 3 minutes in, there's a big feeling good finish to the show. And if we stopped 4 minutes in, it's just going to feel really weird. Then we'll go backwards. We won't try to cram another minute to, you know, to fabricate a fake ending or whatever. So that's a personal decision. But, you know, I think you're right. It depends on your current project and your students and your ability to learn material.
Excellent. Very well said. So I think there's a lot of information in there. I think we'll kind of go ahead and wrap up the preseason preparation part of the conversation now. If anybody in attendance tonight has a question that they'd like to ask, you can certainly type that into the questions field, or if you want to use that raise hand button, we'll open up a line for you to answer that question. Kevin, I do have a couple of questions that people sent in to me, things that they wanted to hear from you about. So I'm just going to launch into one of those, and if we get a couple of other questions as we go through this, we can answer those as well. One of the questions that I got from somebody was, what is your design schedule like, you and your other co-creators? Can you talk to us a little bit about that for some of your groups?
Sure. We, depending on the group, will kind of map out how the season goes based on what shows we're going to and what our staging schedules look like, and kind of work backwards from there. I think probably most people would agree that having the music finished as early as possible is the ideal scenario. You know, I can honestly say that I've not necessarily been the most pious on that front, so that's something that I continue to develop and build in my skill set as I go from year to year and grow. However, I think there's a minor pro and con to both situations, and that minor pro to kind of pacing out some of the design elements within the season is that a lot of times an inspiration will come or a direction for the show will pivot or shift because of how your students have learned to perform the show or the way that the show has evolved because of the real-time staging concerns, the real-time effects that have been generated, the things that are working really well musically. And a lot of times we'll kind of try to find those things and like really cash in on those and really try to make sure that the finished product doesn't necessarily look like it was finished during the show, but during the season, excuse me, but that there is a very clear evolution to the show, and a lot of times, um, I, I can look back historically at some of the most magical things that I feel like together with some of my partners. Some of those ideas didn't come until we've already started doing shows, you know, and I think it would have been a little bit different if the whole show had been written and planned and perfect and all the Pyware drill written before that first show. I think if that was the case, it would have been a little harder to kind of regroup and re-edit versus just writing it correctly towards the end. So I know that it's not the best case scenario in terms of preparation for the students, and so that's why every year we make a pretty significant effort to get earlier and earlier every year. So I feel like this year most of my programs feel like I'm doing a lot better than we were last year in terms of timeline, but I think it's really important to kind of have a good grasp of what it is that you're trying to create and know the strengths and weaknesses of your program and your partnerships, and to know that you know, if you have a schedule that is extremely early, that you leave enough time and room in your season to adjust and ebb and flow. And if you have a schedule that traditionally feels a little later than you would want it to, make sure that you're setting up your students for success by crafting the material such that it's going to be the strongest representation of what they can do.
And I think your first point is a really important one. The creative process is messy, and we've probably all seen that little graphic somewhere online where it's like, you know, what you think it's going to be, and we've got this nice little linear function, and what it actually is, and it's just this crazy mismatch of lines going everywhere. That's indicative of being creative and of trying to invent something from whole cloth that didn't exist before. So be open to that, and if you're experiencing that, don't fret about that experience. Embrace that as part of the creative process. I think I certainly have had this experience. The more I've done that, the more I created something, the better I got at figuring out which rabbit holes I wanted to go down and which ones I wanted to avoid to try to get to a successful output. Successful design is probably, you know, the perfect marriage of I had a plan, we went through this plan, the plan allowed me to be successful, and then I deviated where necessary, where it felt appropriate. When inspiration struck, I hung a left, and we went down that avenue. But if I just started with no plan at all, we'd never get to a finished product on the floor. And if I perfectly mapped everything out, I'd end up with something kind of contrived and maybe not anything that that was that amazing to experience. And the perfect, you know, final product is a marriage of those two things. At least that would be my perspective on it.
Yeah, and I think especially visually, I think there's things that work well planning in advance, but then there's going to be certain things that when you see your students performing, there's going to be things that they can't do. And there's going to be things that you're like, man, I think they could do more. And so I think those are the kinds of things that if you're designing visual live, that at times is a leg up. You know, I think maybe preparing your dots in advance is great, but also having that ability to be live or having a designer live to gauge the abilities of your students, so that, like we said, philosophically, that every single student is 100% achieving and not 50% achieving or could achieve more. You know, so I think those are the kind of things that, again, if you're fortunate enough to design and teach the same group, you're tapped into that all the time, you know. So that's another thing that, you know, yeah, maybe hand out full movements, but I'm able to hand out 10, 15 bars at a time and know that I'm going to see those 10 bars. Can they handle that? Yeah, you know what? They learned that in one rehearsal. I'm actually going to make that beefier. Whereas if I just written 5 minutes all at once, then it's going to be a little bit tricky in terms of reorchestrating something or as I've already learned past it. You know what I mean? So it is a tricky line, and I think with more experience, you kind of find your own formula on it.
Let's see. All right, we've got a couple of questions that people have sent in. I see one over here that, let's see, let's get to this one right now. Where do you personally pull show inspiration from? Do you try to do everything from original ideas? Do you pull from previous WGI seasons or shows from somewhere else? Where do you personally seek your inspiration, Kevin?
I think currently it depends. So currently my projects right this moment are Arcadia High School and Broken City, and projects where we're trying to create something new in terms of our own fulfillment and things that we enjoy. So we try to not do the latter, which is pull ideas from other previous WGI seasons. I think we try to purposely insulate ourselves from any part of the activity currently, just so that as we're creating, we're trying to get for our membership there something pure, and that's from us. In terms of inspiration, I think it's a lot of times it depends on the class, but a lot of times the inspiration comes from a very humanist place. For me personally, and for the people that I create with, a lot of the things that we're trying to create have to do with the human condition, or something that really affects us, or other works of art that have affected us, that we want to try to recreate the feeling that that art might have given us. So for example, like you might take a song, and if you're really inspired by that song, or just something about the way it sounds, or lyrics kind of make you feel, it's not necessarily about, hey, we just have to do that song, but really trying to get to the thing that that song is creating in you, and saying, man, whatever those feelings that I'm having when I'm listening to that or watching that, I want to create those in other people. And how can I use the clay of my organization to try to express those similar empathetic feelings? So it's not necessarily about, oh, finding 3 or 4 pieces and, oh man, this theme would work because they all have the word orange in the title. That's not something that I go to, but that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. I'm just trying to explain what we personally do for our world-class ensembles. Now, a lot of times that actually might make for a really clever and cool way to design a show for some of the other classes, where you do find similarities and inspiration from outside works, and I've seen so many shows and programs that are extremely successful and creative and clever, and so I think there's a lot of ways to do it, and that's why I try to speak to the way that we try to do it. I think it's different for a lot of people, and that's what's awesome about this activity, is the variety of viewpoints that you get, and we really try to encourage that people find their voice and really stick with it. And whether or not people react to it immediately or not, I think that's besides the point. I think what's important is that if I'm an audience member at WGI Finals, I think what's spectacular about the activity is that I can watch World Class and I could see 30 different points of view, and not 5 or 6 points of view. And I think that's what makes this special.
Yeah, it's one of the things I love about the activity so much is the diversity that we have, and that comes from diversity of creative inspiration and diversity of voice. People wanting to express something unique and different than the Joneses, and I love that we do that so much, and I hope that that stays vibrant and healthy as long as this activity continues to remain vibrant and healthy. It looks like we've got one person that's got a hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and give this a shot. Dwayne, I'm going to see if I can get you in here to be able to ask your question in real time. Dwayne, why don't you go ahead and give it a shot? Let's see if your mic's open. All right, Dwayne. Well, if you're able to get it worked out in a little bit, just throw your arm up, back up in the air, and we'll see if we can get you back in here. A couple other questions for you, Kevin. Mitchell's wondering what you would say
Sure.
is the jumping off point for young designers. Is there advice that you wish you could have had early on in the process? And what are some essential skill sets and training you think a music arranger or a visual designer needs to be successful? That's
That,
several parts of a question. So we'll start with what would be a good jumping off point for a young designer, and what's the advice that you wish you had had?
I'm lucky enough to have some colleagues that I work with that pick my brain every once in a while on that front. So I feel like I've kind of given some of these advice points recently, and I think I keep going back to it's like don't judge yourself. Like you have to be excited about what you're doing. Don't try to judge and compare yourself to others because I think if everyone did that, then we'd always feel like failures, you know. So I think it's okay to write, to just do whatever, and if you feel like it sucks, it's fine. It's gonna get better. Like when I write, every time I hit print, I'm like, man, this sucks. Like I don't know if I like it, but you just have to do. You like, there's no substitute for sucking. Like you just have to suck at it, and you just keep being really bad, and then eventually you'll figure out ways to be less bad faster. You know, I guess that's one pessimistic way to put it. But I think what's fun about that though is like if you're excited about doing this, like I I remember feeling excited and staying up all night and watching YouTube videos on Logic or Mainstage or sound design or whatever and just trying to figure it out and not really understanding what's going on, but really just throwing myself out there and immersing myself. And I think that is a huge asset for because anyone can do that. You don't have to have gone to school for composition. I think if you're a composer for ensemble type stuff, some of the best designers in the activity don't necessarily have a ton of formal training. They just have a great curiosity for the activity and are really keen on their sense of style and are really keen on their sense of identity and just really kind of they know what they like and they try to recreate that. So I think that's huge. Like figure out what you like and figure out what it took to make that happen. But a great understanding of theory is also, very helpful. So if you're not really strong in terms of theory, I would say that would be something that if I could go back in time, I would, as a 3-year-old, start taking piano. Like that would be the biggest thing. Yeah, I was in college when I started really understanding the piano, so I wish that I could have changed that.
I think one of the most important things for young designers is to understand is that if you aspire to be a designer, you already have that passion, and there's already a spark in you that said, "I have something I want to express to the world, and I'm going to use this as my medium." It could have been, paint on canvas, but instead it's going to be indoor percussion. And I think one of the
Yeah.
biggest hurdles is that fear of failure that we have to overcome, that everybody has to overcome. In my day job as an educator, I feel like that's the number one thing that I'm preaching to everybody all the time is get over this fear of I don't want to do it wrong, I don't want to be incorrect, I'm afraid to make a mistake. Make a mistake, make a bold mistake. Go out there, put yourself out there,
Right.
and try something. That's the only way you're going to get any value from this. That's the only way you're going to learn is to put yourself out there. So I feel the same way Kevin does. Like I
Yeah.
have the majority of my career, I have pressed print and thought it was terrible and was worried to pass it out to students. And sometimes, rightfully so, I passed it out. They started learning, and I was like, oh, this is a terrible mistake. I've wasted all their time. Back to the drawing board. Other times they started playing it, and goosebumps day one, where I'm like, this is going to be something special. And that's happened for the worst shows I've ever put together. That's happened for the world championship programs that I put together. All of them. There's some insecurity in that, and that's a healthy part of this. I think the next thing for young designers is once you put it out there, um, be prepared to fail and fail quickly, and then recover from that. Don't get
Right.
so inside your own thing. Don't make your own program so precious to you that you're unwilling to listen to constructive feedback. Sometimes I
Right.
got feedback that I did not want to hear. And it took me a long time to get over that, get over myself really, before I took that feedback and was able to turn that and mold that into something more successful. I have to be honest, as I grew as a designer, the more experience I got, the more I was able to filter what feedback I found valuable and what feedback was, had merit to it, but just wasn't what I wanted to do and not a path I wanted to go down. But as a young designer, I would have been wise to listen to every single piece of feedback I got and truly give that some strong, serious consideration. I think the other thing young designers
Yeah.
have to do is to be a student of the game, be a student of the activity. Watch
Yeah.
and digest as much indoor percussion as you possibly can. Watch it from a spectator's perspective. What show lights your hair on fire for reasons you don't understand? There's value in that. You should figure
Yeah.
that out. But also watch it from an analytical perspective. Take a look at some of Kevin's standout programs and seriously dig in there and analyze why he made each one of those phrases exactly the length that it was, why he used this color combination in this phrase, why he shifted from this to this in the next segment. And then do that for all of the programs that you love, for all of the designers and the arrangers that you look up to. If you can reverse engineer what they've done, you're tapping into their creative genius in a way that we could only ever hope to have, those couple of hours to pick somebody's brain. You can do that. Kevin's brain is available to all of us in the programs that he
Yeah.
produces. So you can do that. I got to be honest, when I started in this thing, there were several people in the activity that I looked up to, I revered as, the holy grail of design excellence and orchestrational excellence. And I took apart everything that they did and analyzed it. And that greatly influenced my writing and my design aesthetic. And it allowed me to take what they had done, be influenced by it, and then find my own voice where appropriate and where applicable. And I think that's the best, advice for anybody that's looking to hone their craft and get better at it.
Yeah. Learned masters. I mean, in terms of that's what you do in school, is you're digging apart.
All right, Kevin, a couple more questions for you here. How do you even coordinate instruction between the box and instruction on the floor when you're in a rehearsal? Uh-oh, Kevin's
Mozart and
frozen.
Bach and Beethoven, and you're trying to figure out what they did, and you just try to recreate it. And you know,
Hey, Kevin, we lost you for a second.
can you hear me? No?
We can hear you now. You're back.
Am I back?
Yes.
Okay. Um, okay. So I got the question from box to floor, right?
Yeah. How do you coordinate
I
instruction from
think,
the box down to the floor?
yeah, I was gonna say, we're not generally fortunate enough to have a ton of gym time, so I'm constantly trying to find creative ways to even get box time for what we're doing. So I think it's really important to find clever ways to get a high vantage point, because that will really, I mean, a lot of times we won't even see what the show looks like until the first performance, and then we'll get up there and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, like that doesn't work. So I think the more you could do that in advance, the better off your program's going to be. In terms of coordinating, I'm not really sure I 100% understand the intent of the question, but I really try to make sure that whenever you're kind of in the box or getting a bigger vantage point, those kind of comments and feedback have more to do with performance ideas, more with blended balance, more with engagement, more with just overall aesthetic of the show. And then if there's like individual mistakes happening that you're kind of seeing from up there, then you're communicating to your staff, or you're using rehearsal time to like really address those things in sectionals or some other times to deal with that. So if you do get gym time and you do get a nice vantage point, focus that rehearsal on big picture design elements, because you may not get a ton of that um, luxury.
Hey, Kevin, the next question is kind of going to be a twofer. We've got two people that are asking what I think are probably kind of related questions. So
Okay.
I'll fire both of these at you and you can kind of answer both. Brendan is wondering, or he says, Kevin, when I write, I worry about there being way too many notes for a gem. I don't want it to sound muddy. How do you know when you are getting close to the limit? And Tori was also wondering, as far as front ensemble arranging goes, how do you approach the Mallet book in the indoor setting versus the outdoor setting? So maybe you can talk about both of those things
Yeah.
and your approach.
Yeah. I think that first question I'm probably very self-conscious about all the time because especially when you're writing for currently I'm mostly just creating for world class groups. So I feel like I'm always writing every single bar, every single stave, every single person, world class, every note like I could possibly get in there, and I definitely at times have to like back myself off, especially when I'll write, a minute of music, then I'll have to kind of take it into context and really look at it and give myself space, and actually Mike Jackson and I had a conversation about this the other day. We were talking about a certain passage of a Broken City show, and out of context, it's like, man, there's like 30 seconds that go by and not really very much happens musically. And it's like, well, yeah, but we just did 3 minutes of like balls to the wall, excuse me. But, it's one of those things where if you have to build context over the pacing of the entire show, so that I think will give you a sense of if you're looking at 5 minutes of every stave, every note, you've probably overwritten it, unless that's exactly the intent that you have. But that's probably a good way to start. And then number two, in terms of writing for indoor versus outdoor, um, I think the biggest mistake you can make immediately is writing for all cymbals all the time. That's something that if you've got an 80-piece horn line that's really being aggressive, you're going to need that contribution. And I think it's just kind of been built into our culture. Like you want to see the visual aspect of all 8 mallet players hitting that china with both mallets at fortissimo on every one of those hits. I think it's really important to be judicious with that and really pick and choose your moments. So like within any given movement, like let's say you have a 2-minute movement, you should count the times that you've asked them to play all unison, or even in the battery, like with the bass drums. So if it's 100% of the time that there's a cymbal part that everybody is playing it, you might consider making that a smaller percentage. Maybe it's only the last part of that movement, and then every other point before that, it's spread out a little bit. So that's number one. I think that's going to be the number one culprit indoors, is cymbal wash and low end, either bass drum or subwoofer. Like those things are going to completely cloud your orchestration. So those would be the first ones to look at.
Yeah, I think the resonant potential of any instrument is the biggest thing to be mindful of in the indoor environment. Anything that's got really short decay, um, you can have a pretty liberal approach to the way you want to use it, but things that are going to have a long period of decay are certainly going to wash out, or they're going to combine those frequencies very quickly, and that'll kind of muddy things quite a bit. I always try to just be economical in everything that you do. I think indoor in general requires you to do less than you think you need to. And in most moments, your approach can be just, what do I want to be primary? What do I want to be secondary?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I need a tertiary in this moment. And maybe secondary is not even essential. Maybe we'll wait until we get to the floor, we get into a gym environment, and then figure out if that's adding or detracting from what
Right.
we want the main thing in that moment to be. And then the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with seeing something on paper and going, I'm pretty sure that's not going to work inside. And maybe we'll go in a different avenue, a different direction.
And generally, the eraser is going to be your friend as you get further into the season. Like, the vibes don't need to play every measure of music. Like, or you can insert whatever other instrument in the pit. They don't necessarily need to play the whole time. So picking and choosing the times that those colors come in and out makes when those do come in that much more refreshing.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Like, you lose any sense of variety and color diversity over the course of the show if you're just using all the colors in the painting at once.
Right.
And I think what's important to remember, it's easy to watch world-class groups who are obviously the cutting edge, state of the art of the activity, and they're trying to push the envelope. It's easy to watch them do a lot and to easily saturate. The top of the world class, you'll notice that there's not that sense of saturation. They have found a way to make sure that everybody's pushing the envelope in terms of vocabulary and dexterity and physicality, but in a highly palatable way. So examine that. How do they do that? Oftentimes look not for what they are doing, but what they chose not to do in that moment to allow it to have the primary voice. And then in the A and the open classes, just remember that that's the most important thing, is creating that sense of space. We're fortunate in this activity. The evaluation system is not at all quantity driven, it's all qualitative. So when we look at the composition side of the sheet, there's nothing on there about the difficulty, there's nothing on there about the density. It's all qualitative build up for using quality orchestrational choices, quality sense of variety, continuity, things of that nature. So that's really the direction I think designers and arrangers should head when writing for indoor. Couple questions, and then we'll kind of wrap this thing up. Looks like we've got 3 left. Kevin, when you're attempting to plan a successful season schedule, how do you and the rest of the people that you work with, how do you strategically plan the shows that your ensemble is going to attend? This person would love to know what that looks like, including both WGI regionals and your local circuit shows. So do you have kind of a set approach to that? What's your strategy each year?
I do. I think there's a couple different factors that play. So if you have a scholastic group, there's going to be a couple things like, school events or dances or whatever that are going to just immediately put parameters on your season. So that's number one. So you go through and make sure that you're planning a season that's not going to conflict with, if you've got an early WGI show that's not happening on an SAT weekend or whatever. So that's number one. Number two, for just being really careful with the pacing of the season, one of the things that we did this year is we looked at when our circuit championships happen and WGI finals. Those things are back to back, so there's not really very much flexibility there. But we looked at the circuit championship, and we looked at in California we have the WGI Power Regional at Casulis, the Western Percussion Championship, and then we kind of said, okay, those are our givens, right? The ones that we're going to go to no matter what. And then we tried to pace the shows from there with a little bit of padding, knowing our general design schedule. So for example, with one of the groups, we said we know we're for sure going to Western Percussion Championships, and it would be amazing if we had 2 weekends in between or before that to finish the show with whatever last minute detailing we want to do, and really make the weekend before just be about maximizing. So what we did was our local show is happening 2 weeks before that. 3 weeks before that. Or there's no shows for 2 weeks for us. And then we said, okay, if that's the case, we don't want to go 3 shows in a row, so we had to spread it out even more, backwards from that. So I think the best thing is to kind of work backwards from your shows that you're going to no matter what, and then when you have flexibility, try to build in some time based on your schedule. The worst case scenario in my head for what we're doing would be that we would do show, Western Perk Championships, Circuit Championship, WGI Finals with no weekends in between for an independent group. I think that would be extremely difficult.
Yeah, I think when I used to build out schedules, the key for me was that I wanted every time the group took the floor, especially early season, for us to have more material on the floor the next time. So I think that requires that you put some gaps of 2 weeks or 3 weeks between events early season, so you have time to do that. I never wanted the ensemble to come out and do the same thing we did last week until the whole show was on the floor. So that was kind of the plan. And then I think outside of that, yeah, it's backfilling. It's, begin with the end in mind. How is the season going to conclude? And what do I need to do working backwards to make sure that we're set up for success towards the end of the season? I think with both scholastic and independent groups, another thing that's great, if you can plan some dark weekends in the schedule, either for the scholastic students to be able to do other scholastic obligations, things that they need to do, working around obviously things like standardized testing schedules, SAT, ACT, that kind of stuff, but also high school dances, but just also giving them other time to fulfill things like community service requirements and stuff like that. That's advantageous. But also building into the schedule an opportunity for them to have an off weekend and maybe go to a local show to see some of the other groups that are competing so they can see their peers and network a little bit, meet some people from other schools. That's a huge bonus and plus in this activity, but also get a chance to just see what some other groups are doing, help broaden kind of their perspectives, get out of the bubble of just our ensemble, just our show, just the way we do things, and see the activity at large. I know whenever it's tough to do, but whenever I carve time out of the schedule for that, I found huge benefits coming back to us from the students having that broadened perspective. So maybe it's not 100%. Maybe you leave a blank weekend and you say, hey, we recommend you go do this if you're not doing anything else. If you got other things you got to do this weekend, here's a great weekend to get them done. But I think that's kind of a good approach and strategy to take.
Caleb, there was something in there that you mentioned that I think deals with early season prep. I think it's important when you go to the show, if you have the ability, let your students go into the arena and
Hey, Kevin, we lost you. We'll catch you back up in just one other second. Hey, everybody, we're going to wrap
a
this
couple
up.
groups so that they can kind of.
And he's gone again. We clearly must be reaching our limit for this evening. We're going to go ahead and move on to the last question that I had. This question was from Mike, and it was back to some of the logistics that we were talking about earlier in the evening. Some of those logistic questions.
See what's going on. I think that I build that into the schedule for every group that I work with, so I think that that would be something that would be better.
So one of the things that Mike was wondering about earlier is the order of events for coming into your performance, for getting everything set up. He was wondering, for example, should the pit always come in before floor unfolding? How about when do the speakers, the mixers come in? Should the marching members wear drums during setup? Things like that. I always told my groups that the default was the floor comes in first no matter what. That's the thing that everything else seems to kind of be based around. So we've got to get the floor coming in first so that can start getting unfolded. Immediately after the floor was coming into the arena, the next thing that I wanted was the front ensemble to be streaming in. I always had my front ensemble line up in order outside of the arena in the pre-stage area so that as they rolled in, Marimba 1, then Marimba 2, then Marimba 3 were all already in sequence, so it's much easier for them to roll right into their location. And then after the front ensemble stuff started coming in, then the props were the last thing to come in because those couldn't be staged until the floor was pulled out anyway. In terms, Mike, of should the members wear the drums during setup, I would say absolutely not. I would encourage the battery to make sure that they set up without any of the drums on. If you've got a carrier under the costume, then that can be on, but bring the drums in, set the drums off to the side, or leave the drums in the pre-stage area and run back to that after the floor is out. Or walk calmly since you pre-planned everything, and then have them put the drums on right before they begin their performance. I think that's optimal. Other than, outside of those general recommendations, I think it depends a lot on what your setup is for that show that year, and also what the floor plan is for that particular event. I know there would be times where we would say, okay, since the electronics have to go clear across the floor for today's setup and footprint, all the electronics are going to be going through first. So we're going to allow that to go first today, and then the caravan of Mallet instruments would go second. Or because we're staging on the back side or the front side today, we're coming in through the front, props are going to go first so they can move all the way back to the back. So just that kind of changes on an every week basis. Hey, Kevin, we lost you a little bit there for a couple of minutes. Thanks for jumping back in with us. Couple of other, was there anything else that you wanted to share with regard to that question?
Yeah, I did. One of the things that I also do, depending on the show, is obviously you've studied the layout, beforehand, and you can see where people are coming in and out. Am I gone again?
No, you're good.
Okay. So you've studied the layout, but then the other thing is go before you perform and kind of maybe you can sneak in when another group is about to go on, or kind of watch what's happening with the door around there, and like you can get a sense of, depending on the venue, whether or not they're letting people pre-stage into the gym or not. So I think like having an understanding of that is important, because you might have an expectation where you get up into the door and you say, oh, well, I want to bring, my props in. And that's the only way it's going to work, is if I'm able to pre-stage my props. And then you get to the school, and then that circuit or that show has decided that for that venue that there's no pre-staging. Like, you have to do everything outside and come back in. And these are some of the things that I've actually learned really really well from Caleb over the years, is that there is not really a set protocol that you have, that your interval time, whether it's 9, 10, or 11 minutes, is the time in the building, not necessarily time across the line. So I think people have possibly misunderstood that point generally, and it's a good point to know that 9 minutes is how much you're allotted in the building at the worst case scenario. So be ready for that worst case scenario.
All right, just to wrap this thing up really quickly, I want to thank you guys so much for coming out tonight, everybody that attended live and sent in questions. I know I appreciate that. I think I can speak for Kevin as well on that front. We've got the next one of these scheduled coming up in a few weeks. If you're subscribed to this, if you're registered, you'll get reminders about all of those upcoming things. We're going to do this 4 times over the course of the season. Tuesday nights, it'll be the same time. Each one of these, so we would love for you to jump on. The other thing that I want to ask is that if there's a special guest that you would love to hear from, drop me a quick note. You can send me an email at caleb@wgi.org, or you can find me on Twitter and send me a message that way, at Caleb Rothy. My first and last name is my handle there. Would love to know if there's anybody in particular that you'd like to hear from. We would also love to know if there are specific topics that you'd like us to cover. For instance, our focus tonight was getting prepared for early season shows. I know I've already received a couple of topics, future ideas for future editions of this, but we're always looking for more. We want to know what's on your mind. What kind of insight would you like? We certainly want to make sure that this serves you well, especially if you're going to give up some of your valuable time and spend it with us and our crappy internet connections. So we appreciate you doing that and coming out and joining us, and hope that you will again next time. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Caleb. I really enjoyed it.
Good, man. I'm glad. And there was one final question that I got from Peter about starting up a new group. Peter, if you would send me an email with that question, it's a rather involved one, so we'll kind of take that off air, but I'd love to respond to that and give you a couple of tips and suggestions there. Again, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for the first one. We hope you'll make plans to tune in again here in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caleb.